So we start our consideration of the US Constitution by taking a look a little bit at the historical context in which the document was written. We now know that that document is going to last for centuries with very few amendments. Only 27 amendments were added to the US Constitution. But we have to remember that hoping to create something that would last a long time, they had specific concerns that they needed to solve. So in many ways, they were worried about solving problems, immediate problems, the 18th century problems that they were facing. Um, they were hoping that it would be successful, but at the same time, they recognized that they had certain things that they needed to solve. So we're not going to be able to go through all of the history. Taking a history class of this period is certainly important, and some universities even require it, or at least recommend it. But we are going to touch on the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and then the U.S. Constitution, main emphases in this class. And we're going to particularly emphasize the ways in which the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, influenced what happened with the U.S. Constitution. So let's start with a few videos that I have suggested for you. When you take a look at that, I've listed two of how I learned about this period of history. Many people my age did. They would show them between Saturday morning cartoons. So I'm having you watch two of them, No More Kids Around the World, on the slides. You should take a look at that. A couple of things to think about when you're watching the videos is certainly enjoy them, but also is to think about and reasons why I would be showing this not simply in between cartoons, but why this might be helpful for us to think about this political period, this historical period. And one of those in No More Kings is that the cartoon depiction of the king sitting on his throne with bags of money and he's eating and not really caring is a good visual representation of a different model of authority, the idea of the divine right of kings, that he is chosen by God and therefore he can do whatever, and that the rights that individuals have come from him and then from God. And the idea that we would negotiate these things or have a different approach is something that's very, very different. There are other things too. They're going to be showing videos like this throughout the course, and one is to point out the ways in which there might be things that they say in a 3 or 4 minute song that isn't entirely true. And so at the end, they say, we're going to elect a president and he's going to do what the people say. And that's good for a cartoon, but as we've already talked about, it's the Electoral College who officially chooses the president. So in some ways, yes, we have a role in it, that our votes do influence how the Electoral College does its work. But at the same time, it is not entirely true to say, as it might imply, that we elect the president. The other thing is that with the idea of popular sovereignty, the president does not always do what the people want. So again, just something to think about it as you're watching it. In the Shot Heard Around the World is actually a very good discussion of this entire colonial period. Particularly, I want you to recognize some of the things that it gets right and then some of the things that it gets wrong. It's actually in one particular section where that happens. The video correctly points out lent us ships and guns, which means that we had to pay them back at the end of the Revolutionary War. And that's going to play an important role during the period after the American Revolution, that in addition to coming up with a political solution, we also needed to have an economic solution. We needed to be able to pay off the debts that had accumulated. And that put pressure on our new government under the Articles of Confederation and became very hard for the Articles of Confederation to deal with those. And so the right that France and Spain lent us ships and guns, and that's an important thing. They didn't just give it to us, they wanted it back in terms of any unused ships or unused bullets they wanted back, or they needed to pay for those. But there is another issue where it's not entirely correct, and that is the idea that it mistakenly suggests that they supported us, the plucky Americans, and they wanted to support them. It's important to recognize that France and Spain were not in support of the ideas of the American Revolution. Both France and Spain were very deeply involved with the idea of the divine right of kings that we saw visually in the No More Kings idea. And so the French Revolution was until 1789. Our revolution was, started off in 1776 with the and so this was before France had its revolution, and Spain was also one that had a king that believed in very strongly the ideas of the divine right of kings. And so when they suggest in that cartoon that they did it because they liked us, that's not entirely correct. And so what I ask you to think about, France and Spain lent us the ships and guns during the Revolutionary War. And what you need to think about are the larger geopolitical context in which this happened. France and Spain were rivals with Britain. And so in many ways, their viewpoint was, look, anything bad for Britain, it's got to be good for France and Spain. So having a revolution, having some of their colonies try to break away is going to distract Britain. It's going to make them spend resources on protecting those colonists and keeping the territory. So they were certainly happy as well that France and Spain were both Catholic countries, whereas Britain was a Protestant country. And so the religious aspect did that. And so you have a number of reasons, despite the idea that they liked what we were doing, that explains better why France and Spain lent us those ships and guns during the Revolutionary War. So enjoy the videos. Don't obsess too much about some of the historical inaccuracies, but it's important to recognize the messages that can be contained in some of the things that might not be entirely true, and some is because of the audience that we're talking about. So moving on, we want to talk about the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is obviously an important document. It's a political document, but it's not a legal document. The Declaration of Independence is certainly worth studying. I assigned it for you to read. It's something that people go to visit in the Smithsonian. We have copies of it. We have it online, and so it's something that can be read. A lot of other declarations of independence were based on the Declaration of Independence. It's an important document that way, but it is also important to recognize that the Declaration of Independence has no legal authority. And that means at the time there was no international court that the Declaration was presented to. The court listened to it and said, well, I guess that's right. The United States is now independent of Britain. And the other is that it has no force of law in our domestic courts. You can't go in to a court in the United States and say, I am suing this individual or I'm stopping government action because it violates my rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as the Declaration of Independence talks about. The Declaration of Independence has no legal authority. Many people, it is a different document. It had a different role. And so we need to recognize that as we go forward in analyzing it. And so what we need to do is to just have some background information to understand independence. Before we can understand the argument, you have to know a couple of things. The first thing you need to know are the ideas of natural rights. The idea of natural rights, again, is the idea of the divine right of kings. The idea of natural rights can be seen in the Declaration of Independence in the phrase, all men are created equal, and then a discussion of what those rights are, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so the idea of this is that we are given these rights because we're human beings. And instead, under the divine right of kings, the king grants certain rights to certain individuals and then can take those away. It's a very different authority structure. According to this argument, all men are created equal. We're equal in the sense that we have all of these fundamental rights, these inalienable rights, as the Declaration of Independence talks about. Okay. Another thing that this brings up is that when you have this idea that all men are created equal, and the document was written by Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, that causes some problem that some people point out and rightly point out. It's going to be something we talk about with the Constitution as well. The Constitution is built on slavery. Slavery was built into the document, and it is hard to see that document without recognizing and understanding the role that slavery plays. And so we have to say that with the Declaration of Independence as well. This idea that all men are created equal, written by someone who owns slaves, points out that this is a political document. They're trying to make an argument rather than being actually accurate in all things. The other thing about this idea that a slave owner and slavery was part of this conversation is that we know from understanding the Declaration of Independence that the phrase life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is one that was driven by slavery. At the outset, using the political theories that Thomas Jefferson was using, it should be life, liberty, and property. That is the correct way in which that phrase should read in kind of philosophical ideas of it. It's the right to life, liberty, and property that are these natural rights. But once you bring up the idea of property, slaves were considered property, and therefore it brings up and dilutes the power of this argument that all men are created equal. If you said rights to life, liberty, and property, was changed to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The other thing is that we know in the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson got carried away in terms of the list of grievances that were listed on the Declaration of Independence. That there was some concern that the um, Declaration of Independence included things that it might not. And one of the things was that Thomas Jefferson included was they actually blamed Britain for slavery. They said it was Britain's fault that we have slavery. Like, TJ, that goes a bit far. Nice try. That's not something that we can do. And so that draft was changed. So one is this idea of natural rights, that all men are created equal. The other aspect of the Declaration of Independence that's important are the idea of social contract theory. And social contract theory is the idea that instead of God giving the power to the king and the king deciding what sort of rights individuals would have, it is this idea that there is a contract between we the people and our government. And so each side has rights and responsibilities. And according to that viewpoint, the government is only legitimate if it does its job. And so its job, not to give things away, its job is to provide and protect these liberties of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So as long as it is doing, we do have to pay our taxes. We do have to listen to what the king wants us to do, what Parliament is saying we have to do. Whatever the government structure is, we have to pay attention to it. On the other hand, so that is a responsibility that we have, that if the government is doing its job, our job is to pay our taxes, is to follow the laws. But on the other hand, if the government doesn't do its job, if it is no longer protecting the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the terms of the Declaration of Independence, then we do have a right to overthrow that government. And so that's the idea of, and once you know these ideas of natural rights and social contract theory, then the argument of the Declaration of Independence is relatively straightforward.